Love or lust? Men particularly must learn to distinguish between unselfish, unconditional love and selfish, conditional lust.
David's sin was selfish. Now, at least he took Bathsheba into his home after Uriah died at the hands of David. But we also know that probably at that point in his life, he was still trying to cover his sin, still trying to look good. But the fact is, he did take that step. But the act of what he did was extremely selfish, which we know impacted his family. And we see here one of the horrible, horrible results of that sin with Ammon, the son. We witness rape within his own family. It's a very sordid story. And let's look at Amnon's infatuation with his sister. Here in 2 Samuel 13, 1 and 2. Some time passed, and David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister named Tamar. And David's son Amnon was infatuated with her. Now, this was an incestuous passion. And Amnon was frustrated to the point of making himself sick over his sister Tamar because she was a virgin, but it seemed impossible to do anything to her. And the fact of the matter is, this is probably one of the most selfish, lustful situations. This kind of lust. The man is literally sick because he can't fulfill his lustful desires in this particular situation. And of course, then he came up with a plan. A friend told him about a plan to feign sickness so that he could call for his sister to come to him in his bedroom and take care of him and to feed him and to help him. And in that process, he grabbed her and he raped her. It's a horrible story. But what we see here is such a human, sinful, human, selfish, lustful reaction. The lust turned to hatred. And we read about that in 2 Samuel 13, 15. After this, Amnon hated Tamar with such intensity that the hatred he hated her with was greater than the love he had loved her with. And there we could define that love that he had for her as lust. And he says, "Get out of here. Get out of here," he said. And then later, he told the servant, "Throw this woman out and bolt the door behind her." And we know that in the Hebrew, the implication is she's a bunch of trash. I mean, that is an incredible, horrible description. But this happened because of David's sin. Now, Amnon is responsible for his own actions. But what he is doing is playing out, living out an even more sordid situation than his own father. Because David did not set a good example. Now, I say in the principle that men particularly need to learn to distinguish in this area between lust and true love, but women have the same problem in some instances. We have an illustration of that with Potiphar's wife. It's exceptional, probably, in the situation, but you'll remember that she was the one that lusted and lusted and lusted, and then Joseph ran from the scene. She got angry, and her lust turned to hatred. And she accused him of actually sexual harassment when her husband came home. And here we read about it in Genesis 39. Then she told him the same story, that is her husband, that she told to all of her servants. The Hebrew slave you brought to us came to me to make fun of me. But when I screamed for help, he left his garment with me and he ran outside. In other words, her lust turned to hatred. And that's an incredible dynamic, isn't it? How that can happen in people's lives. That happens in people's lives today. Just recently, heard about a man that just got married and killed his wife when she's still in the wedding gown. And you begin to ask yourself, what in the world went wrong there? I think that we could summarize that probably lust turned, or love, quote, end quote, turned to hatred. I mean, in her own wedding gown. We may never know what happened. But the fact is that we see this played out in people's lives, and it's horrible result of sin. So the reflection response question is, why is it easy to allow selfishness to impact our intimate relationships with our spouses, even though we are Christians? And I think one answer to that is that we're still human. And we're still victims of sin that's in the world. But the good news is that Jesus Christ has come to deliver us from sin by demonstrating to us agapao love. Agapao love, which is one of the words that is used to describe love, true love, in the true sense of the word, as it's the word that is used in John 3:16, for God so loved the world. And here in Ephesians, Paul says that we are to walk in love as the Messiah also loved us. That's agapao love. He gave himself for us, a sacrificial, fragrant offering to God. But then Paul goes on to say that within this context of agapao love, sexual immorality and any impurity or greed should not even be heard among you, as is proper for saints. And then later, he applies that particularly to men as husbands and says, after saying we're all to love as Christ loved, he says, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So we have the potential to love at that level and to grow in that love, which, by the way, is action. It is doing what is right regardless of how we feel, with God's help as the fruit of the Holy Spirit. But we're also made in God's image with a phileo kind of love. A phileo love is more of a feeling of where we can show family affection to one another with brotherly love. Pure brotherly love. Amnon was not driven by this kind of friendly love. And feeling love. He was driven by lust. Because there should never be any relationship outside of marriage that leads to sexual immorality. But there can be tremendous friendship, which God says we should demonstrate to each other apart from sin. But God also designed irao love. Irao love is referred to by Paul in 1 Corinthians, the practical outworking of irao love. Do not deprive one another, except when you agree for a time to devote yourselves to prayer and then come together again. Otherwise, Satan may tempt you because of your lack of self-control, and there God is dealing with the sexual relationship between a man and a woman who is married. And so God deals with all dimensions of this love. Agapao love, but part of that is phileo love, and part of that in God's design is irao love, which should be guided by agapao love, the love that does what is right, does not do what is wrong, and does not take advantage of other people. And by God's grace and strength, he gives us the power to live that out, even though it may be very difficult. One of the problems in our world today is they reverse the process. They actually reverse that process, and they define love as irao. And that's when they think they're in love. And you know how long that lasts in marriage if the marriage is based only on sexual feelings. That's why you see so many divorces in Hollywood. And that's why you see so many divorces of people who admire those people because they model after them and they think that they have the true definition of love. And they go from one person to another, but irao doesn't last. They're always looking for a better experience. But see, within God's plan, we start with agapao, the right kind of love, God's love, which leads to true friendship. And then within God's plan, we express those feelings, those sexual feelings, which is God's design. And so consequently, one of the things that helps us in this to apply this principle is to really understand what true love is, and also to understand how it can be distorted. And so we want to apply the principle of true love. The principle we've looked at here is that men particularly must learn to distinguish between unselfish, unconditional love and selfish, conditional lust. And let's remember that that can also be true in applying it to women, because Potiphar's wife definitely was involved in this kind of situation where her lust turned to hatred and accusation against the man that she was trying to seduce. Because she was rejected, she turned and accused him falsely. And we see that kind of thing happening also in today's world. Hopefully, it will not happen among those of us who are Christians.